All right, I am Karen. I'm a developer advocate for Velo at Wix. I am also joined by Joshua Alphonse. He is also a developer advocate as well, and we will be kind of manning the chat. So if you guys have any questions during this webinar, feel free to ask them, and we'll answer as fast as we can. And I will be presenting to you Yoav Cohen, who is the head of training here at Wix. He is joining from Tel Aviv, and yeah, I'll leave it to him. Hi, Yoav.
Hey, Karen. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for the introduction, and it's great to see everyone. I also saw a little bit of the comments where everyone is from, a really, really international audience, which is awesome to be talking to. So nice to meet you all. We're not going to waste any time. We're really going to jump into things straight away. I can feel the excitement, even though we're like still socially distanced and everything. But we're going to dive into it straight away. I'll show you guys the agenda of what we'll be talking about over the next 45-ish minutes. And of course, there's the Q&A tab that you can use in the webinar to ask any questions. Both Josh and Karen are available to answer questions during the session, and we will also have a short Q&A session at the end. So what we'll be doing today is we'll be talking about an introduction to the Timeline Animation API, what exactly it is, how it works. We'll be doing a demonstration on how to code your own animations, and we'll be doing this in two ways. I'll be showing you both in the presentation and I'll be demoing this in the editor itself. Excuse me, so you'll get to see this twice. And as Karen mentioned also at the beginning, this will be recorded. So if you're reviewing this, you can pause, try to implement, review, go back, forth, view it at 1.5, 2%, 200% speed, however you like. It's really here for you. And we'll be demonstrating today creating what we call micro interactions. So there's very cool like interactions that you have when you hover over something and things move, those types of things. That's what we'll be starting out with today. And we'll be showing you guys resources that you'll be able to use to continue on your animation journey. So feel free, please, to ask questions throughout the webinar. Again, our entire team is here to answer those questions. And again, we'll be keeping some of your questions maybe towards the end to answer them in the open Q&A that we're going to have. So let's start with discussing what the Timeline Animation API actually is. And if anyone on the call has never heard of what an API is, API stands for Application Programming Interface. And if we break that down, or if I have to simplify it, it's basically how we are able to program with something online. Now, there are thousands upon thousands of APIs out there around the world. We at Wix have our own API, which is exposed through Velo, through our development platform. And the Timeline Animation API is one of the libraries within that API that allows us pretty much to do exactly what you're seeing on the screen, compose an animation over time. Now, for the designers or video editors on the call who have experience using everything from, I don't know, Windows Movie Maker all the way through to Adobe Premiere, you'll know what a timeline looks like and what how these video editing softwares look like. You'll have something, let's just say here on the top, which is where we'll be adding our elements on Wix, excuse me, and where we'll be seeing the actual visual animation happening. And at the bottom over here, pretty much as we see here with the graphic user interface, we're going to have the actual timeline, always starting here at 0. Because that's where our timelines always begin, and then moving over time to create various different effects. Now, unlike the applications that we have with movies, here we'll be using a couple of lines of code to create these interactions with our stage or our canvas and the elements that we have up over here. A little bit about coding, and I don't want to scare anyone away when it comes to people who are more graphically oriented in terms of your coding, but if you do have a working knowledge of JavaScript, that's definitely going to help you, because that's going to be the language that we'll be using to code in Velo. If you don't have a working knowledge of JavaScript to code, don't worry about it. Today we'll be simplifying exactly what you need to do in order to create your first animations. We'll give you guys a couple of rules of thumb to use when actually coding. And again, I'll be demonstrating these. You'll be able to review them, and highly recommend using your copy paste tools that you have in Wix to take the lines of code that you've already written and then repeat those so that you're again avoiding maybe typos, grammar, or syntax mistakes along the way. But alongside that tip, I also want you to remember that in JavaScript, just like many other, if not all, coding languages on the computer, JavaScript is case sensitive. And if here I put an uppercase A, the computer is going to read this as an uppercase A and not a lowercase a. And so we really have to make sure that the exact syntax is what you see here on my screen is what you're going to be implementing yourself. If you're going to have typos, you're going to see this like red underlined squiggly thing that's going to come underneath your code, and then you're going to need to debug it and understand where these issues are. So remember, again, that you're going to follow the exact syntax that you need to follow if it's from the examples or for what we see here in the presentation, and use your copy paste again to avoid these typos. Now, to customize the animations that we'll be using today, we'll be using a notation in JavaScript which uses properties and values. And this is pretty much like settings that you have in your computer, or again, any sort of setting that you have in anything from Photoshop to Premiere. You're going to be, for example, determining the duration of an animation by using the word duration, a colon, and then how long the duration of the animation is going to run. And scaling is going to be very similar. We're going to write the word scale and then tell the computer, tell Wix how long we want or how big or small we want the scaling to scale. Now you'll see here some big numbers, some small numbers. Just remember, and again, we'll go through all the various things that we can do within the animation API, but the most important thing to remember within how we use, again, these properties is that when we count in JavaScript, we're actually counting in milliseconds. So 1,000 milliseconds, like we see here for our duration, is actually a single second. The advantage of this is that this allows us to create very accurate animations. So if you want to run something very quickly, we can use 100 milliseconds, and then that's going to run very quickly. Whereas if we go to higher numbers, so let's just say 8,000 milliseconds, that's going to be 8 seconds and give us like a nice, easy, slow duration of an animation. So if you think about, I don't know, clouds going slowly across the summer sky, if that's the animation that you want to achieve, you can play with these numbers to be pretty accurate. The final thing that I want to talk about in terms of coding, and this is not necessarily JavaScript, but specifically for Wix. If anyone has never coded with Velo, today we'll be demonstrating how to use, specifically in Velo, our Wix, what we call our $W selector, in order to select the elements from our canvas, from where we'll be selecting them, what we have on our actual screen on our site, and then how to connect to those in our code in order to start using them and customizing our animations. So now that we have those down, we understand a little bit about how we'll be coding. Let's look at the attributions that we can use in order to create our animations. And we have 4 main attributions that we'll be going through briefly, reviewing, excuse me, what they do, how to use them, and then we'll see in a couple of minutes how to implement them. So you see already the 4 of them on the screen. We have scale, we have position, we have opacity, and we have rotation. Now, how do we use each one of these? Let's have a look. If we start with opacity, you'll see that we have here a sphere on the right that is going between fully opaque and fully transparent. And the way we're going to implement this opacity is by using the word opacity and then giving a value anywhere between 0 and 1. So 1 is going to be 100% opaque, 0 is going to be 100% transparent, and then anything in between is going to give us some sort of value in between. So 0.5 would be in the middle of exactly being transparent and opaque. In a similar way, we can do scaling. So scale 1 is scaling at 100%, scale 2, 200%. If we go down to scale 0.5, that will give us 50%. And always remember that scaling is going to start from the center. If you think of the center of gravity of our element here on the screen, and here we're growing our sphere proportionally, on the screen, but we don't necessarily have to skip, to stick to that scale, to scale something proportionally. We can also use scale X to stretch, our ball out. Maybe it's being smushed on the ground as it's landing. And we can scale it also along the y-axis. So here you're seeing scaling 1.5, maybe I'm stretching the ball, maybe I threw it, up against the wall, depending on what you're trying to achieve. We can also scale to each one of these axes individually. When we talk about rotation, so here we're talking about going around the clock. So 90 degrees is 90 degrees. You'll also see here that we can use a slightly different syntax. If we want to add an additional 30 degrees, we can use here, instead of a straight number, we can use what we call in JavaScript a string. And this is why you see here our double or single quotation marks. We can use each one of them, either double or single. And plus equal 30 means that we're going to be adding an additional 30 degrees to the rotation that started previously. We could also similarly minus equal 120 degrees, and that's what we're seeing now with the cube rotating back. And that's going to move counterclockwise. If we wanted to use a different type of property here, or a different number, we could say, okay, rotate 90 and add an additional attribution, which is rotate direction. And CW here in this case is going to stand for clockwise. If we had to use CCW, this is going to stand for counterclockwise, and we can force the direction of a rotation. We could also say minus 90 degrees, and that's also going to force the direction of the rotation. Now, why is this good? This is good because if we want to achieve, let's just say, a lottery wheel turnaround, it's only going to go in one direction. We want it to go, let's just say 540 degrees or some big random number, which could be easily coded. So again, we can force the direction to go clockwise or counterclockwise and just add the number of degrees that we need. And that is going to, that any element that you're going to add here is going to turn with the direction that you want. Let's look at positioning. Positioning along the x-axis is pretty easy to implement. Again, we're going to use the letter x and enter the number of pixels that we want to move. In this case, right. This is pretty much like high school math. Along the x-axis, we're going to move. As we move to the right, our values are going to grow. The y-axis, though, is going to behave slightly different from what we remember in high school math. And this is because the logic of a web page always starts at y0 at the top of the page and grows. That value of our y-axis grows as we scroll down. So y90 is actually going to give us the ball scrolling down, okay, as we see here in the beginning of the animation. And minus equal 180 degrees is actually going to push the ball back up on the screen. Basically, if you see your element moving in the wrong direction, this is probably going to be, if it's along the y-axis, then you're going to have to go and just flip it around. So just keep that in mind when you're starting to create animations that may have to run along this axis. So just to summarize that part, guys, we spoke about 4 main attributes that we will be using, and I'll be demonstrating a couple of them now when we get to talk about the API structure. We spoke about scaling. We said scale, we can scale proportionally, or we can scale to the x-axis or the y-axis. We spoke about positioning. We spoke about opacity, and we spoke about rotation. And remember, again, that the more you practice using the API, the more you try to implement these different things, you'll see how the structure works. You'll see how these different attributes can be used and combined together in order to create various and crazy animations that you want. But again, we'll start simple today. We'll start with a couple of micro interactions, and let's see how to start implementing those. So if anyone has never here on the call used the dev mode in the editor, when you open the dev mode, and I'll be showing you, I'll be running through our editor back and forth here right now between our presentation and the editor. When you open the dev mode and you open what we call our IDE, our integrated developer environment, this is pretty much what you're going to see on every page, what we call our $W on ready function. Okay, I'll get to why this is important in a second, but if anyone has not implemented or has never opened the dev mode, just so that you see where it is, it's here at the top. This is free for anyone to use, both on the classic, drag and drop editor or an editor X, as Karen mentioned at the beginning of the session. The API will work on both the classic editor and editor X. When we turn on our dev mode, this is going to open 2 new panels that we have here in the editor. This left panel, which has a whole bunch of tools that in a separate webinar we can get to and discuss. We can actually minimize this here for the meantime. We don't need that panel at the moment. But here at the bottom, you can see our integrated developer environment, our IDE, with our $W on ready function already here. We also have here on the right a properties panel. If I now select any one of these elements, I'm going to be working here with this arrow over here. You'll see that its name is populated here in the properties panel. And we know that this is the name of the element, because if I zoom in here, you'll see here that we have this hashtag, which says arrow text next to it. And we can also customize this name if I wanted to here in the properties panel. So I can call this 123, and this is going to be reflected here as soon as I exit this in the hashtag over here. So you can also give your elements coded names as you need to. I'm just going to leave this as arrow text because that is pretty much explaining what this is. And we'll be talking about this panel in just a little bit. But why this $W function on ready is important? Why do we have this on every page that that we open in our dev mode? This is because JavaScript depends on what we called events, meaning when something happens on our screen, its logic, its behavior is going to be determined by the JavaScript code that we'll be writing. Now, when we want to write our code, we have to put it in the correct places. For what we see here on the screen, the function that we see $W on ready, this is a special function that is going to run any code when the page is ready. And that code is going to run as long as it's placed between our opening squiggly bracket and our closing squiggly bracket. So an additional JavaScript tip that I can give you guys is when you want to run any sort of code, it has to be, excuse me, within a function. Again, definitely for our animation API, you always want to put your code between these squiggly brackets. There is some other code though that we need to implement. It is pretty cut and dry, but we do need to implement 2 lines initially so that we can start using the animations API. These are these 2 lines here at the top. With the first line, I'm going to go through this very, very briefly so we understand what they do. The first line, import Wix animations from Wix animations, basically allows the page, brings the animations API to the page and opens access to that from the Wix back office. And the second line here, const timeline equals Wix animations.timeline, is a shortcut which we're saving here in a variable called timeline, which we'll be implementing here in our $W on ready function in a second. So if I go back to our editor here, let's just type those in. You always want to make sure that these are at the top of your code. So here in line 1, I'm putting my import line. You'll see also here that we have a really, really cool and makes life so much easier using autocomplete. So we can see here we have Wix animations from Wix animations. Enter on my keyboard as soon as I start typing that, and that's going to complete that line. I'm just going to again add my const timeline here, just as we saw in the presentation, and Wix animations dot timeline with my 2 brackets over here. And now we're pretty much ready to start creating our own animations on this page. If I go back to my my editor, where am I going to create these animations, at least initially? Again, we said JavaScript has these events that happen. So the special event that we have here right now on ready is when our page loads, when our page has completed loading. So we're going to right now do our first animation in this function, and then we'll get cool and more advanced in just a couple of minutes. But to get started, we're going to basically like opening a new file in our video making software. We're going to write the word timeline, and this is going to create a new timeline for us. And then we're going to use the word add with a period here, so period add. And this is going to add, let's just say, a new timeline, an actual new line of effect that we can add within our code. Now, within these brackets over here, again, we can use our autocomplete to add these brackets. We do need to add a couple of pieces of information. The 2 pieces of information that we have to add are, number 1, the Wix element that we want to work with. If you remember, I spoke about the $W Wix selector. So we have to use that selector to choose which element we'll be working with. If you remember my arrow from just a couple of minutes ago, we'll be working with that right now. And in these squiggly brackets over here, after a comma, we have to add the actual animation attributes, what we want to do with it. So again, what we'll be working with, and then what we'll be doing with it. Within our attributes, we also have to have at least 2 things. Number 1, we have to have the duration. So if you remember, we spoke about duration in our example here, it was 1000 milliseconds, but we always have to have duration and what movement we're doing. So am I rotating, moving along the X or Y axis, changing the positioning? Am I scaling X, scaling Y, whatever you want to do, but always it's a duration, how long the animation is going to run, and the movement. What does this look like in practice if I have to now implement it first in my presentation, and then we'll go back to the editor? Let's just say we're working with a box on our screen, so $W with this syntax, and then I choose the hashtag box. That's going to select the element from the screen. And within our squiggly brackets here, our animation attributes, I'm going to write the words duration, in this case, 1500 milliseconds, so 1.5 seconds. And X, I'm going to be moving this box 600 pixels along my X axis. The final thing that we have to add in order to create our first animation is just like we had on our old VCRs. If you remember, we had to press play in order to play our CD or our VHS tape, depending on what generation you're from. So here as well, we have to add a play command in order to play our animation. And so with these 3 lines, again, timeline, adding a new timeline, adding at least one line of what we're doing with our which element and what we're doing with it and the word play. That's how we've started creating, we have created our first animation. So I'm going to do that now in my editor. I want to take the animation that I'm going to be trying to do. Again, I'm focusing mostly on micro interactions. Is I want to take this arrow and I wanted to like hit this text over here. And then eventually we'll move on to more advanced things. I want to move it back and forth and play around with it. So again, I'm going to implement that over here within my $W onReady function. I'm going to write the word timeline. Again, I have my autocomplete, so definitely use your autocomplete. And underneath that, write the word add, period, add, and open and close my regular brackets. Now here I'm going to start selecting the arrow. So I'm going to do this again by typing $W, opening brackets, hashtag within quotation marks, and selecting arrow text. And again, I understand if this is quite a bit to get used to, but again, once or twice you do this, you'll get used to the syntax and you'll be able to implement it. A comma and some squiggly brackets again. And here's where we will be defining what we want to do with it. So again, duration is always something that we have to add. So I'm going to set this at 900 milliseconds, so almost a second. The reason why I'm doing something so long is that we can actually see the animation. This would be like slow motion. If I'm going to actually do this in like real life, I'd actually add here a duration that would be something like maybe, I don't know, 250 milliseconds or something like that. But for our training purposes, we'll do 900. And I'm going to move this along the x-axis around 45 pixels. Okay. The final thing, if you remember, that we need to add is another dot and the word play. I'm going to again use my autocomplete here. And there, guys, we have our first animation. What does this look like? Let's have a look. I'm going to, first of all, save this because that's something that's always good to do. And then preview this. And let's see what happens to our arrow. There we go. Our arrow is moving 45 pixels to the right and touching my T exactly where I want it to. That's great. It's a good start. Like it. Here within just a couple of minutes, we've got a really nice, what will be micro interaction set up. But I do want to add a couple of more things to this. Again, we want to make it a little bit more complex. So let's continue. Let's look at something called easing. Okay, and what we're doing here with easing is we're setting the acceleration, the deceleration of an animation. And why this is important is because, like, if I have a box here on the screen, I hope it doesn't like blend into my virtual background, and I throw it up in the air and it lands up somewhere over here, it's not going to move in a linear manner like from one point to the other. It's going to fly up in the air, deaccelerate, and then fly back down and accelerate again. And these types of movements are what we want to achieve within our animations in order to, again, make them more natural. Okay, how do we do that? We'll see that in a second, but just so that you get an idea of what easings we have, if you have not yet seen some of them. You saw one of them actually in the first slide of our presentation today. Those are animations that are taken from the Timeline Animations API. But here we have, for example, easing, ease out elastic. And this is going to give us this like, jumping, hour line on our clock. This is the effect that you're going to get. We also have things like ease out quad, easing quad. It's the same example that I gave of, a ball being thrown up or a box being thrown up and then landing out, and then slowing down or speeding up, and things like ease out back. Now we do have more of these. These easing options are available, for you to use. And how do you know where to find them? This is where I want to show you guys. Oops, excuse me, wrong direction. This is where I want to show you guys our Velo API reference. And this is something to definitely keep in your bookmark. If you do use the Timeline Animations API quite a bit, I would save this so that you can come back to the screen straight away. If I go here to the add command, which is what we've been using up until now, and then go down here to animations. This may be open or closed when you open it, but I open up here the animation attributes, which is the things that we've been playing with. Oh, excuse me. You'll see everything that we've been talking about so far. So opacity, rotation, all these different things. And one of the things that we'll be seeing here, if I go down here to E, is easing. Okay, so this is where, again, this is my personal preference. I always have typos in my code. So this is my go-to when I want to use easing. If I want to use an effect over here, the easiest thing to do is to take the effect that we want. So ease out sign is a nice one that I really like to use, and copy that over. And now if I go here back to how we implement this, it's as easy as adding another comma in the same line that we had in our code, in our same add line, add the word easing, another attribute with another value. Easing, in this case, we have ease linear. In my code, if I go back here to my editor and I'm going to implement that, I'm going to say, okay, comma, easing, and paste that same ease in sign that I had before. Just make sure, again, that you have that in quotation marks. This is actually going to be a string that comes from JavaScript. So again, ease in sign. And if we now preview this, we'll see that we have a slight difference of how that that animation is working. Again, it's in slow motion, so you may not see it that quickly. But what is happening here is just like we see if I go back to the reference, is that our arrow is like slowing down as we get here, as we start the animation, and moving up slowly as if it's accelerating. So again, ease in sign, we could also take ease out sign. Maybe that's something we want to also add over here instead, and then we'll see the difference. Go here, preview, and then our arrow again is slowing down. Very cool. Again, we've added a more natural look to our animation, but again, we want to take it a step further. So if we want to take it a step further, let's have a look at this example. Here we have the word reactions. We have an element, a text element in this case, and we have, if you take a look at the timeline that we have over here. Actually, we have two timelines. We have one that's pushing the reactions up with an easing, okay, and then another one that's pushing it back down on the y-axis, and again using a different easing. And this is the effect that you can create easily with micro interactions by copying and pasting lines of the code that you've already written. So if I go here back to my editor to achieve, again, my arrow going, instead of ending here at the text, I wanted to go back here to the 2. It's as easy as taking the line that we've already written. So I'm going to take my add line here, okay, copy that, enter on my keyboard, go down to line 11, and then again, all we have to do here is change a single attribute here. Let's just take this and say -45. We'll keep our ease in, our ease out sign here. Or actually, let's change it to ease in sign, okay, and see what the difference between that. So now what we're going to have, if we preview this, is we're going to have our arrow moving to our T and then moving back to our O. And I see here, maybe I do want to add one change here to my code. Instead of -45, I'm actually going to make that -48 or 49, so that this is going to actually hit the O on the head. Let's make sure. There we go. And then again, we've got our arrow moving in two different directions here. The final thing that I'm going to do here, I'm going to do this straight away in my editor. I'm going to add another line to my add over here using that same arrow text. I'm going to bring my X down to 0. So it's actually going to move it to the original place that it was. I'm going to take that ease out sign again. I actually want to keep that. And let's have a look at our complete micro interaction so far. There we go. That's looking pretty nice. So what we have here is our arrow bouncing from right to left and then back to center, guys, within just a couple of minutes, copying, pasting some code with the Timeline Animations API. Very easy to achieve a very simple animation like this that is custom to my needs. But again, we want to get a little bit smarter here. We want to get a little bit more complex. So let's look at something called offset, okay? And this is going to help us start creating more complex animations with not one, but multiple effects happening at the same time. So this example of our girl with the kiwis, with the kiwi eyes, I like to call her, what we have here are a couple of elements on the screen. We have a green box here behind the image that is not moving. We have a yellow box that is actually being pulled down and to the left, and our kiwi girl is being pulled up and to the right. Okay, you can also see here that our text element is not doing anything, so that's actually just staying in place. And what we have here is, again, a number of lines of animations on the same timeline. But the way to implement how them working at the same time is to set an offset of 0. Okay, or you could also set offsets of higher values, and then create animations that start running one with the other or one after the other. But once we set offset to 0, things are going to start happening at the same time. How do we implement the offset? So let's have a look here in the presentation, and I'll be doing this again in the editor. Again, very simple. We have what we're working with. Take note that here we have our image, and then we have a different element that's being selected here. So $W yellow. we have the attributions that we've added here with our properties and our values. And at the end of the line, okay, remember we start our timeline always at 0. So the first line is going to start at 0. If we want something to start at the exact same time, we're going to use a comma and then add the number 0 at the end. So it's as simple as if I go now to my editor, if I now want to say, okay, this micro text, micro interactions here, I want it also to move around. Maybe I want it to jiggle around with my arrow text. I'm again going to add another, another line here. Again, just copy paste lines that we've added over here. So that, again, we're using the same syntax. I can change the name of the element that I'm working with. So here, micro text instead of arrow text. And I'm just going to say here, micro text. Let's go with my autocomplete over there. My duration, I'm going to keep it. Let's just change it to, I don't know, 500 milliseconds, half a second, so we can see the difference. On my X, I'm actually going to move this, to be -1. I'm going to change the Y to be 2. So I'm just adding these attributes as I'm working with it. And I'm going to say, you know what? I want to also rotate this 3 degrees. So I'm using very small numbers in this case, very small values. But again, I'm using micro interactions here. So this is, again, we want to create these very small things, that are going to move on the screen. The final thing that I want to do here is add 0. If I didn't add the 0 for the offset, what would happen here is it would run each one of these lines one after the other. The minute I add the 0 here at the end to create an offset, this is going to run at the exact same time as the arrow text starts to move. So let's have a look at this. Okay, let's preview this. And there we go. There's our micro interactions moving at the top, and then our arrow text moves at the bottom. And again, just to play with this again to demonstrate how the offset works. If I now wanted to create another couple of lines of animation here for my micro interactions text at the top over here. So I'll leave this duration to 500 milliseconds as well. I'm going to move my X to be 1 and my Y to be -1. So again, it's going to give it a little bit of a jiggle. And my rotate is going to go to -2 as well. And my offset here, I'm actually going to set to 500 milliseconds as well. And that's because I want, as soon as this animation has completed, so this duration has ended after 500 milliseconds, this line can start. And this is where I start creating, again, more complex animations, but again, using the attributes. I know when one ends, when another begins, and I can set that in the offset pretty easily. So now if I go here, and actually let's just add one more line at the end. Okay, so this is going to end after 1000 milliseconds, my offset after both of these lines have run. I'm going to move this back to 0. So I'm going to set all these back so my micro interactions can go back to where it was previously. And what this is going to look like is just like that. Again, so we've got our arrow moving. I'll just preview this one more time. Our arrow moving, our micro interactions text moving as well. All just with these couple of lines of code that we've written so far. But that's not all, folks, because I do remember we spoke about creating micro interactions. We do want to turn this into an actual interaction. The code that we've written up until now has actually stayed in our $W on ready function. So it doesn't help me now if I want to actually create some sort of interaction here. Let's talk about that and let's see how we do that. To do that, we're actually going to use something called event handlers. And what these are in Wix and generally with coding with JavaScript is the way to create interactions based on things like clicks, hovers, basically whatever we want to interact with the user, or the different ways that we want to interact with the user, we can use different event handlers to determine the behavior. The way that we'll be doing this is by using the properties panel that we have on the bottom right of the editor. We can use any one of the events that we have here, depending on the element that you're selecting. You may have different events that will be available, things between your galleries or text elements, repeaters, they all have different types of events. They all behave slightly differently. So if you haven't used them before, I would recommend experimenting with a couple of them. But once we add an event handler, let's just say on click would be for clicking or on mouse in would be for hovering, that's going to add a new function for us. And then we can write all of our code there, just like we've done so far. So the way to do that is here, if I now want to hover, when I hover over my arrow text, I want this code to run. Again, I'm going to select my arrow text here on the bottom right. We have all of our event handlers. If I use, let's just say the on mouse in, which will be our hovering in event. If not going to be relevant for what we will be doing today. But there's some important information there. If you have never read it before, then I do recommend reading it. And to create an actual interaction now, to make our code dependent on when we actually hover in over our arrow text, what I'm going to do is take all the code that we've written over here so far from our $W onReady function. I'm just going to cut that and paste that here again between my two squiggly brackets, the opening squiggly bracket of my function and the closing squiggly bracket. Just add my timeline in over there. And here, just within just a few minutes, we've created our first micro interaction. And what this is going to do is now nothing's happening when I've loaded the page, but when I go and hover over my text, excuse me, my arrow, that's created that micro interaction. So that's really looking pretty cool. I really like that. I love these little interactions on various websites that that I visit, and also websites that I like to build. I really believe that there's a lot of value in creating these sorts of interactions with your users. It keeps them engaged, it keeps them interested, it keeps them scrolling down and seeing what's more in your site. So while you don't want to overdo it, these small things really make a difference in terms of getting people's attention and having them click or move where you want them to go. So guys, again, we've been running for around 40 minutes now. Unfortunately, we can't run too much longer. What I would like to show you guys now, at least within the last few minutes that we have, are some additional features that you can use, or we won't be demonstrating these, but I'll show you where you can find them and how to explore them, how to play around with them and try them on your own. The first place that I recommend that you visit is, as I mentioned before, the Velo Animation API. What we have over here, if I go here to the top level of our Wix animations over here, are all the functions that you can use within the timeline animation. So if I now go and start scrolling down, you'll see how to implement things. You have here a lot of code that you can copy and paste and use in your editor as well. You have here, again, additional information on how to use the actual timeline, that same command that we were practicing today. You saw that we used the add command. You have additional things like pause, play, repeat, reverse. Basically, again, full functionality on controlling how your animations are going to work and how people will interact with them. Highly recommend exploring the API and again, taking code snippets from here, copy, pasting them into your editor and adapting them to your needs. We also have, our timeline animation landing page. Again, this is the screenshot of what you saw on the first slide of our presentation. This is how you probably got to the webinar itself. You get great examples here of how to create animations, or the examples of animations, just like we created here. So here is our arrow, the word interactions. You see pauses when we hover over it. So all these things are available for you guys to get inspiration from. Let's flip this and see what that's going to do. And it's really fun to scroll through these and see how they work. If you want to try some of these on your own, if I scroll here to the bottom, you'll see that you can also open specific examples yourself. Okay, now when you open these examples, or if you want to explore these examples, they'll be opened here on the Velo website, where we have tons of examples, both from the Timeline Animation API and from other places. Now here you get both the code snippets, so exactly how this was created. You get a full description of how it was built. And if you want to play around with the example itself, you can click to edit this in the editor in your own account, play around with it. Again, change it to be your own, copy paste it to a different website, do whatever you want with it. It's yours to use and enjoy. So guys, that's pretty much it for today, at least from my side. I'm going to pass the baton over back to Josh and to Karen for some Q&A. Guys, what do we have?
Cool. So it looks like we have a few questions we've been answering in the chat. We didn't really see too many inside of the Q&A tab, but some questions that we can bring up that some of us asked. I don't know if everyone saw, but some asked, would be able to see the animations beforehand, before we go and publish the site, or before going to preview mode. And currently, like, you'll be able to preview your animations when you click on preview mode, or only on the published site. So there's not like a capability to click on the editor to see the animation beforehand. But if you like to see it in action, you can always click preview and see it and go back and forth between the editor and preview mode to see your entire interaction. Oh, can't see me. Got it. I'm here. Cool. Hey. Awesome. And then we have some other questions too. Some others asked about the elements on the page and if they come with any presets as well. So when you have a new element on the page, if you drag and drop it or just selecting an element that's there, it already comes with a preset name. So like, for example, if you have a button, it will come up as button number, I don't know, 53 or something like that, depending on how many you have on your page. And you'll be able to change the preset name to something else that you'd like. So if it was something that you wanted to animate later on, let's just say for that arrow, for example, that we saw earlier, you can name that arrow anything you'd like animated arrow or arrow animation, whatever you want to name it. As long as you can recognize it in your code and be able to use it and organize it, it'll work out for you. And then someone also asked, can this be done to a lightbox? Thinking of a cool transparent logo mask, moving this photos underneath and using this technique. So a lightbox, you'll be able to use the animation API. So lightbox is comprised of a bunch of different elements together. So pretty much like acts as a window, but you can have drag and drop different elements into the lightbox to pop up. So you'll be able to use all those different elements that it's comprised of and add different animations to them as the lightbox pops up. So again, like even back to Yoav's example about using $W on ready, you can add functions into there in that lightbox. So when the lightbox loads, you can make those animations happen, or vice versa with other functions that you can create and use like functional programming techniques to make those happen. Someone also asked, does the animation code appear in dev mode if already animated an element in classic mode? If so, would you be able to modify it from there? Okay, so I guess you're mentioning some of the animations that we have from the elements that you can click from the menu that pops up. This is completely different, actually. So some of those interactions you'll still be able to use if you have them selected, like the way that they'll appear. But this is a completely different type of micro interaction that you're creating programmatically. So this is a bit different from the classic mode. This was all completely the developer mode. No question from Vlad. He's just saying thanks for the amazing work. Thanks to Yoav for presenting this to us. So we're here just to back him up. So thanks to him and thanks to the rest of Wix. And someone also asked, can you use this event handler on viewport, enter a trigger to an animation? Yeah, so you can use all the event handlers to trigger an animation. So if it's on click, mouse over, whatever you want, you'll be able to use them to make sure those animations happen whenever those events are triggering. Does Wix able to have these timeline animations functions as users scroll up and down the page, for example? Yeah, so that pretty much goes into that same question about on viewport. So they want to know if you're able to scroll up and down. You'll be able to do that as soon as the viewport enters or leaves the element that you want to animate. Let's see if we have any other questions. Karen, did you see any? I don't know if anyone direct messaged or anything.
I think we answered most of them. We got a couple about site speed, and it should not impact the performance on your site. But you also want to remember, just best practice, you don't want to animate literally everything on the site, just be like, information overload. So, make sure you're using like small, I like Yoav's example of the micro interactions, because those are just like small like moments of like joy rather than just like bam, 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 bam animation after one another. So just keep that in mind when you are adding animations to your site.
That could be really
busy. Yeah, very, very busy. Someone might leave your site. You might get a bounce rate if you do that. Yeah, and then the last question I see that just popped up is this JS embedded in HTML? So not really.
I'll answer that one. Yeah, it's not really embedded within the HTML of the site. What Velo is doing is opening an additional layer to which we can interact with the stage, with our canvas, and we're using JavaScript to do that. There are some possibilities within Velo generally to implement a little bit of HTML with text elements and maybe one or two other places. But I'd say right now this is a different layer from the base HTML of the site. I'm hoping I'm getting that. I'm answering the question that was asked.
No, I think that was very succinct. Yeah, I mean, there is the option to add an HTML or an iframe element where you can embed JavaScript and CSS and HTML on your site, but that's a completely different element, and that's not really what we're talking about when we're talking about the timeline API and using Velo on your site by enabling dev mode.
Okay.
Cool. Anything else?
Yeah, feel free to ask any more questions. You can ask some last minute questions in the chat or in the Q&A tab. Or just let us know how excited you are to use the animation API. Someone just asked, eventually, can this work with Wix Store's product page? That's a good question. Not really, like with all the elements that are there. The product page itself from Wix Stores is just a solid block really itself. So you really want to be able to animate all the other little elements that are there, but you can drag and drop your own elements into the product page itself, right? Like different arrows and buttons you want to go to different pages and animate those, or any of like vector images, but not directly all the products on the page that comes up for Wix Stores. Hey, Yoav, can you share with us some best practices? What are the pros and cons with hover interactions?
Okay, a couple of pros and cons. I think we touched on briefly when we said we want, especially when we talk about interactions, to find that good balance of, again, drawing into interactions and engagement and not, being too busy. One of the websites that we worked on for our team for the Wix Hub, we have a playground of elements on the top fold, where between hovers and clicks, you can move different elements around and change almost the layout of the first fold. But other than that, we did not add additional interactions to the homepage, because that's where we kept our playground, and the rest was more informative, and through different clicks, you get to different interactions. So that's a good balance, I think. At the same time, you also, not that performance would be, I think, impacted if you, again, stick to a good amount of animations, but not too much. If you're trying to animate everything on your screen all the time, you're trying to engage with, 50 elements at the same time, you may start seeing things here and there slowing down, again, depending on the type of interactions and type of elements that you're trying to work with. So again, I'd say don't overdo it. Remember as well, you want to start small, especially if this is the first time or the first couple of times that you're coding using Velo and using the timeline animation API. Step by step, I'd say, start with the things that we've started working with today, and then grow from there. Find the right balance. If you can also, achieve certain things in the classic editor by using the animations that we have there, because you're not dependent on other interactions, that's great. But again, remember that those are limited. The power of the timeline animation API and generally in Velo are these events where I can hover in on something and do something, or on viewport to enter. All these different events that I can create to customize what I'd like to achieve. So those are some considerations, pros and cons. I love it. I use it pretty much on every website that I build. But again, with balance, like everything in life.
Sweet. Awesome. And we have, thanks, Yoav. And we have one last question as well from Lisa. She asked, is there any best practices to keep your code clean for using the timeline API? Well, this is kind of like a general question too, for just anyone getting into JavaScript development and want to use the timeline API as well. There's always ways and techniques to keep your code clean. Just always, try to keep your code concise as you can. And also, you can use different formatters and different ways to beautify the way that your code looks. Luckily, inside Velo, there's a formatting tool. So if you just right click, then I believe also, it's right click. There's also a keyboard command as well to format your code. So yeah, it's like Shift F. Is that what it is?
This would be Shift Option, I think. Yeah, Option and F.
Yeah, Shift Option F on Mac.
Yep. Or just right click and format.
Yeah. And that will bring your code all together, format it there. And then you can have all your different animations and different things that you have in your timeline that you're adding all in order. And you'll be able to make it look nice and clean and follow your timeline all the way down. So that's probably the best way to do it. And then just, look at some things in JavaScript, build some projects, and you'll go through all your, you'll make your mistakes with your formatting, but this tool's already built in. Ready to go. So
using the formatting tool is also one of the easier. What's one of the ways that's that also help you see if there are any typos or again syntax errors or those sort of things. So right click or use the keyboard shortcut, and then you'll be able to see exactly what you may need to fix.
Yeah, and it will check syntax, not necessarily like typos. So right. It will check to see if you wrote your functions correctly, if you've had the correct elements that you're selecting. That you've actually created and whatnot. So it won't show typos, but it will fix your syntax along the way. So depending on how you spell things already yourself. And that's it for our questions.
Cool. So I think this is the time to say thank you. Thanks to Josh and Karen and Asaf, the WOW team, the Velo team who helped put this together. It's really been a pleasure working with all of you. Thanks to everyone who joined today from around the world. This has really been awesome. Really looking forward to seeing those micro interactions, generally to how you guys use the timeline animation API. And look forward to seeing you on our next webinar that we'll be doing.